Finally, with Mill looking at chapter 4, which is about proof. It's about whether the principle of utility can actually be proved. The difficulty, I have to say, that I have with this chapter is figuring out exactly what he's referring to when he refers to the principle of utility. It doesn't seem to be quite what he states in chapter 2. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's always at least a related idea. And I would say that what he's really asking about is really here at the beginning of the first page of the chapter, page 79 at the bottom. He says the utilitarian doctrine is that happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end, all other things being only desirable as means to that end. One of the ways you can put that in traditional philosophical language, traditional language of moral philosophy, is that happiness is the good, meaning the sole good, the greatest good, that pleasure or happiness, because of course we should remember that he defines happiness as pleasure. And we know how complicated that is, right, from his defense of that. That happiness is the sole good, that whatever we want for the sake of happiness. We choose it for the sake of happiness. And all other things that we want, for that end. Now, how do you prove something like that? Here a certain degree of logic is involved, right? I mean, some things we can prove, mathematical theorems, for instance, or hypotheses of different sorts, or but we prove them by means of other things. And then we can ask, well, how do we prove those other things? Well, we prove them by means of other things, and so on, until we get to something like what he would call a principle or a first principle. And those things are really the starting point, because logically speaking, I think classically, the idea is that you have to start somewhere. And you start with what is most self-evidently true, what seems to be most obvious and least in need of proof. And that is here the principle of utility, the idea that things are good because they increase happiness. They're bad if they decrease it or cause unhappiness. So how do you prove something like that? Well, I mean, a first principle is something that really can't be proved. First principle is something that, to a certain extent, just needs to be taken for granted, and literally taken for granted. The question is, is it plausible enough? Is it self-evident enough to actually, be granted like that? Well, I suppose it what he's asking us to do is to ask ourselves whether it's obviously true to us, whether that thesis that what we want is happiness always, and that we choose things because they increase happiness or prevent us from being unhappy, whether that seems obvious enough for us to accept. Of course, if we were to take this line, I think one of the, completely reasonable implications of it, or if one were to guess what the implications of this thesis would be that, we choose everything for happiness, so we choose everything for selfish reasons. And that may ultimately be true. That is, that even if we are doing things for others, even if we are following the greatest happiness principle and doing things to increase the general happiness, we're doing it because it makes us happy. And I think that he accepts that. And that would explain why in the latter part of this chapter, he goes so far into the question of virtue. I think when he's discussing virtue, he's really discussing following the greatest happiness principle in the sense of doing things to increase the happiness of others, not just oneself. And arguing that when you are, that being virtuous in that sense is also something that makes us happy. Or at least that we can train ourselves or cultivate ourselves to the point where being virtuous does not mean ignoring our own happiness or doing things despite our own desires for happiness, but rather cultivating ourselves to the point where virtue itself is something that makes us happy. That is, doing things for others is something that makes us happy. And I think that is a huge theme in this book. And as I said, politically, ethically, socially, it all sort of melds together for Mill, because what he's really thinking about is a better society, ultimately, a society in which it's just taken for granted that we all want to do what's good for everybody.